Welcome to Grow Money Business, the podcast dedicated to helping business owners grow both their wealth and business on their own terms. Here's your host, Grant Bledsoe.
Hello, everybody. Grant Bledsoe here. Welcome back to Grow Money Business. This week on the podcast, my guest is Brad Baldridge. Brad is the founder of Baldridge Wealth Management and runs the website tamingthehighcostofcollege.com. Brad is an expert in college funding and knows pretty much everything about merit and need-based aid and what you can do to reduce the cost of college for your kids or perhaps for yourself. We had a really good discussion today. Brad ran us through a bunch of tips and tricks he has up his sleeve, little planning nuances and opportunities that business owners might be able to take advantage of. I hope you enjoy the conversation. I took a lot away from it, and I hope you do too. Hey everyone, I need to interject quickly to remind you all that nothing found in today's episode or any other episode of Grow Money Business should be considered financial, investing, legal, tax, fitness, or even relationship advice. It's content that you're free to use and to deploy on your own terms. And before taking any actions on content found on the show, please do consult with your tax professional, your attorney, or your financial planner. If you don't have a financial planner, head on over to threeoakswealth.com to learn more about what we do in terms of financial planning and investments and how we help clients on an ongoing basis. Alrighty, and I am here today with Brad Baldridge, who is an expert on college funding. Brad, thank you for being here. One of the first things I want to ask you is a real whopper. Why is college so expensive right now anyway?
Well, I mean, the short answer is they raised the prices and the students still came. So they raised the prices again and they still came. So it's the basic economics of supply and demand that they have enough customers, so to speak. And why not raise prices if they're still going to come? There's a much more, there's a lot of additional challenges, of course, around state funding at the state schools has been cut. So they've been raising prices. And then private schools. And I guess another challenge is, efficiency at a factory, right? If they say, well, we had 500 employees and we made 1,000 widgets 10 years ago, and now we have 7 employees and we make 10,000 widgets, that's fantastic. That's progress. But when you visit a school, you don't want to say, we used to have 1,000 professors. Now we only have 7. We teach 10,000 students with 7 professors. That doesn't sell. So everybody wants the one-on-one individual attention and so forth. And that would apply in healthcare as well. And therefore, it doesn't scale very well. And again, by definition, it's just going to get more expensive when you want that one-on-one personal attention.
Right. And when it's being subsidized by an endless sea of student loans, that helps your supply and demand dynamics too.
Right. Absolutely.
So how did you get into this space? You've been at it for quite some time. How did you become interested in the cost of college and paying for college in the first place?
Yeah, so I've been a financial advisor for years and years, and then as I was working with families, I realized that college was an issue, and as I got more and more involved in it, I realized there were a lot of strategies that most people weren't aware of around need-based aid and merit aid and saving and investing and all the different things that you could do. And occasionally someone would do one thing well, but not the rest. Just like general financial planning and running a business and all the other things, right? There's a lot of different plates to keep spinning around college. And most people, at best, were keeping 1 or 2 plates going. And so I started helping families with all the areas, and it became a business where people started to seek me out just for the college help. And I started building some resources and website and podcast and more again, free resources like my scholarship guide to help families, whether they actually hire me or work with me or not.
That makes a lot of sense. I've got a ton of questions for you on this topic, but why don't we start with this one? I have probably a rudimentary understanding of funding college compared to your knowledge base, but one of the things that I do understand is that when you apply to a school, or when your kid applies to a school, they get accepted. Your application goes to the student aid office. They're trying to put together some package to make it compelling for you to go to the school. the sticker price of what shows up on the websites and what's published is not always the price you're going to pay. Can you maybe start by explaining a little bit about why that is and what we can do to reduce that sticker price?
Right. So, yeah, and what you're talking about is the most expensive private schools have just crossed $80,000. And yes, that's per year. And that's what we would call their published price or their cost of attendance, which includes tuition, room and board, books, fees, beer, and pizza. It's the whole cost for a typical college student. And state schools are in the between, I don't know, 25, 20, maybe 20 at the low end, up to about 30, 35,000 for in-state students. And again, that's the price that's published, but a lot of people pay that price with the college's own money or federal money or grants or other things. So there's two things that families need to understand. One is, of course, the total price, but more importantly, what is the net price? The average public school now has about $22,000 in scholarships. So that brings their net price down quite a bit more than the $8,000 that the average public school would have. So private schools list a lot more expensive, but net, they're still more expensive on average. But I've seen many families go to a private school for less than their state schools.
22,000 and 8,000 being the average amount of scholarship that's given per student per year?
Correct.
That's a pretty hefty number. So,
right. And there was a study done about, well, why do we play these games? Why do we publish an artificially high number and then turn around and give everybody money off? And the short answer was because that's what people want. We literally asked people that, it feels good to get a scholarship. So in general, that's what happened. And some schools literally will give 90+% of their students a scholarship. So apparently they can make them all feel special just by giving everybody a scholarship. Other schools, it works a little differently. So that's, so it can get complicated as far as, but in general, it's list price minus all your free money is your net price. And then from there, you got to pay that net price as efficiently as you can.
So how can you use that information to select schools to apply to in the first place if you don't have a whole lot of guidance over what the net price might be in the first place?
That's the challenge, right? So if you understand how need-based aid and merit aid work, you can kind of like use that information and start finding schools that might be a good fit for you. Broadly speaking, there's 6 types of schools out there. There's 3 public and 3 private. So in the public realm, you've got your in-state state school. That's often the low-cost school that most families would have. So that might be the price to beat. So here in Wisconsin, it's about $25,000 to go to our flagship University of Wisconsin in Madison. That's and then a couple thousand more in some expenses. So all in, maybe $28,000. But the actual bill is $24,000, $25,000, plus books, plus travel, plus a couple extra expenses. So that's where many families can start, is just understanding what they're up against. In California, they've got 2 systems. The UC schools are more expensive than the state of California schools by quite a bit. So there it's about $25,000 and $35,000. Illinois, New Jersey, New York, some of those states have more expensive schools. They're approaching 32, 34. And Iowa and Wyoming and some places like that have much lower costs, in the 18 to 20,000. So that's why we have averages around 25. And many states are near the average around 25. So that's kind of the first option, right? Is just pick a local state school in your state, and it will be the low cost option as far as both sticker price and what you pay. For many families, you end up paying full price. Once your income's over, say 75 or 100,000, you're not going to qualify for much in the grant programs federally, and most states don't have a lot of aid to offer. So, families in the 100,000 in income and up typically pay full price. unless they
That's
happen to
the
have
family, not the student, right?
correct. Yes. So everything is based on the family. So financial aid forms, et cetera, they take into account both the student and the parents. And there's ways that a student can be independent, but most families aren't going to be able to take advantage of them. There are things like if the student is married or if they have children of their own, part of a federally funded runaway program, if they're separated from the military, active service, that type of thing. So most parents are going to say, well, I know how we're going to pay for college. Why don't you go get married? I mean, it just doesn't work. But if it happens to be true that your son or daughter had 2 years in the military and now is out, well, they might be independent, and great, take advantage of it. So that's kind of where we start. Then we've got the out-of-state state schools, and most people understand that there's a higher tuition for out-of-state families, and many schools have enough demand that they get that out-of-state price. So the big flagships, UCLA and UC Berkeley and UVA and Georgia Tech and University of Wisconsin and University of Illinois and University of Michigan, all the big name brand popular schools, a lot of them are full out-of-state price. So now they're 50, 60, 70,000 a year. But then there's a lot of schools that offer things like reciprocity. A Wisconsin family can send a student to Minnesota and get the in-state price, and a Minnesota family can send their student to Wisconsin and get the in-state price. There's reciprocity around the Oklahoma and Texas panhandles, where if you're in the Texas panhandle, you're actually closer to Oklahoma and other states than you are to most of Texas. And you can actually send your kids to some of those schools that are closer for the in-state price. Likewise with Oklahoma. So there's all these different side deals that are around the country that would bring the price down. Usually not less than what the in-state would pay, because that's kind of political suicide to say, well, some kid from out of state who's never paid taxes here pays less than my kid. So they generally aren't going to cross that line. But the out-of-state families might pay something very similar to in-state, again, because of the reciprocity. So that's kind of the lay of the land for the public schools. For the private schools, we've got what we call the elite privates. They're the ones we've heard of, the Harvard and Yale and Stanford and the high-end schools. They're crazy expensive, $80,000 a year plus, but they're also very generous. So many families, might get a $60,000 or $70,000 scholarship at an $80,000 school, and even pay zero. Right, up to like $60,000 or $70,000 at many of these schools, you're going to pay zero. And the challenge is you've got to get accepted to these schools, and they're extremely selective, and they only admit a small percentage of their applicants. And the applicants that they do admit are rock stars. They're just fantastic students in most regards. And, again, by all means, if you have that type of kid, take advantage of it. On the flip side is if you happen to have strong income, you're a small business owner, so your taxes, you got an S corp or something, so your taxes show a lot of income, and a lot of times it's very frustrating because those same schools don't offer any sort of merit aid. So your kid's a rock star, but because they don't offer merit aid, you end up paying full price just because of your finances. So that's the elite schools. And then we have the private schools where they want you. So if you apply to a school where you're an above average student, they might offer, a $25,000 scholarship for the academic excellent kid. And the academic excellent, it varies by school, right? You might be average at one school, but a rock star at a different school, because some target the A student, some target the B student, some target the C student. So if an A student applies to a school that targets C students, then you might qualify for aid, even though that same student can't even get into Harvard and Yale and other schools. Mm-hmm. So it's finding the school that's a good fit and understanding this whole game, right? I mean, everything I just talked about means you need to, spend some time learning and understanding which of these schools are a good fit for you. So will you qualify for need-based aid? Will you qualify for merit aid? And at which types of schools? And then you can perhaps come up with a list of schools that you might have a good shot at getting aid at, and might focus in on those schools instead of ones where you won't.
Right, right. So you framed it at the beginning of our episode today as a supply and demand equation, and we keep paying the tuition prices. Yes, there's a substantial amount knocked off of that for need and merit-based aid in a lot of circumstances, but kids are borrowing a lot of money. They have this endless opportunity to keep borrowing student loans, which has put upward pressure on tuition prices. It seems like since the pandemic, more people have been open to exploring other ways to get their general education requirements knocked out. Regardless of whether you're at your local community college or Harvard, calculus is calculus. And because I think more people are, if you're not going to be in the classroom in the first place because of the pandemic, why would you pay the sticker price? Do you see that as gaining enough momentum to put a dent in tuition prices? And how are you seeing that evolve?
Yeah. So I think in general, higher education's ripe for some revolution. I don't know when it will come, because there's this challenge in that it's the parents that are footing the bill in general, not the student. So for parents that can afford to, I don't know about you, but my college was a fantastic experience, and I'm willing to pay so that my kids can have a similar experience, and probably pay a lot more than I should. And we're seeing that out there a lot, right? Where people that can't afford to pay are willing to, and therefore they're skewing the overall results. It may not be worth it from a pure economic numbers kind of thing, but there's all the intangible of going off and getting on a campus and meeting a bunch of different types of people, et cetera, and growing up a little and studying abroad and all the things that you can do. So I think most families that can afford to do it will do it. And what's interesting as well is if you do a lot of good planning, it's overwhelming and challenging, but it's not impossible for most families to at least send their kids to the local state school, live on campus, and get the college experience. And again, for many families, stretching a little bit more and going to a private school is possible as well. And then there's, of course, some families that have enough resources where they're saying, you know what, instead of a lake home, we're spending our money on college. And nothing wrong with that, right? I mean, we could buy more expensive cars, we could buy a lake home, or we could spend more money than we should on college. That's what we choose. That's what we're going to do. And there's nothing wrong with that per se. We all work hard to earn our money, and then we all spend it in some foolish way most of the time. Whether it's education or, like I said, cars, vacations, crazy lessons for our kids, you name it. So that's kind of the lay of the land. Will things do people consider going to a low cost option and then transfer? Yes, for sure. But it's not the perfect solution, as some would say. And if you're going to do it, you want to make sure that what you do will transfer to where you want to go next. And there are many colleges out there that are kind of catering to that. They're saying, all right, if you go to these, again, there might be, say, an engineering school. If you go to these various schools and take some of the basics here, if you take this math class, we'll take it. If you take that math class, we will not. And they'll tell you that up front. So you now know, well, these are the courses I should take in order to transfer. But a lot of people, aren't aware of that, and they take the wrong math class, and then they're frustrated when they try and transfer, and they say, okay, well, we're not going to take that math class. So you're going to have to take it over. And, so some of that, and then there's, like a typical nursing school, it's very regimented. They're going to probably want all 4 years on their campus and lockstep with everybody else. They bring in 160 freshmen, and they all take the same courses as the freshmen, and then they all move on to the sophomore courses, the junior courses. Then they go out and do their clinicals out in the hospitals and that kind of stuff. And they all go together. And to try and get into that program in the middle is nearly impossible. So it really depends on, what you're looking to do, what major, and that type of thing.
Sure.
And what experience you want to have, right? It's a big difference living at home, driving to the local community college, than getting on a campus and going to their football games and making new friends. And, what a lot of parents remember as the best time of their life. And again, they're willing to pay for it.
Right. Well, like you, I had a very good experience going away to college and having that kind of environment where you're inserted into a new community and you've got to make new friends and figure it out. And there's this old, unique culture and in the dorms, and that was a great experience. And I'd love for my kids to have that as well. My kids are younger, but I'm also open to the fact that the whole landscape could change in the next 10 or 15 years too. And
Yes.
who knows? It's a long ways off. So when you're advising people on planning to apply and enroll and choose the right school for them, when does this process start? How do you get started?
Right. So, so let's talk a little bit about the timeline. Obviously, college is something that from conception or birth or however you want to think about it, it could be part of the plan, right? You could start saving and investing for college when you have a baby or whenever, right? But there's also what I would call late stage college planning, which is where all the real heavy lifting is. And that typically starts sometime in high school, where you're going to start visiting colleges, choosing majors, figuring out how to apply, financial aid and financial aid forms, all the stuff you're going to have to do, which again, you're not going to do that for a 2-year-old, but somewhere I recommend freshman, sophomore year, especially if you're like a business owner or you have a complex situation, you've got twins, you've got blended families, you've got things that make things a little more challenging. Freshman, sophomore year is not too early to start on the late stage of let's start learning how financial aid works to figure out if we're going to get some. Let's start visiting some schools or at least looking at the price tags. Let's understand how the loans work if we think we're going to need loans. Let's try and figure out if the pile of money we've saved over the years is a big enough pile, and how are we going to use it efficiently when it's time. All those kind of questions you can start working on at any time. And then as your student gets ready, then it's, well, let's go visit a college. Let's figure out what majors and what does it take to apply. And, the students got their responsibilities, figuring out what, figuring out what they want to be when they grow up, figuring out, doing the right courses in high school and getting the good grades and putting up the right test scores. And then the parents kind of have their responsibilities, again, saving and investing for college, understanding need-based aid and merit aid, and, kind of minding the store and making sure the student does what they're supposed to do. And then the things that you do together, the visits, test planning, right? Are you going to hire a tutor? Test optional is becoming very popular now, where maybe you can skip testing altogether. That's a COVID thing. So with COVID, testing became a challenge. So most colleges said, we're not going to require it because lots of students just couldn't get it done because of COVID. And they didn't want to chase all their customers away. So they had no choice. Some have realized that it works out pretty well and they're going to keep it. Some perhaps are not. And it's the jury's still out as to who keeps it and who doesn't, and how the new landscapes will look around testing. But it's another thing to start thinking about is, will my student test well? Should we take the test? Should we skip the test? Are we looking, if you have a around the country kind of kid, you've got more work to do, right? If you're saying, well, maybe some Boston schools are appropriate, or Texas schools, or California schools. It's like, okay, well, how many of those are you going to visit? Those are pretty, major road trips, at least some of them, depending on where you live. And versus, my student is either going to go to the local state school in this town or that town, and they're both an hour away. Okay, well, that's a little different planning process than flying around the country. Or if you're involved in athletics, again, my student's going to play baseball. Not sure where. We got to figure that all out. Or at least he hopes to play baseball. Is he good enough? All that, there's a big process there. So kind of a long answer to a basic question, but start saving and investing and planning around, should I put $200 away for college? Should I put 1,000 a month away now or later? And then when you get to the sophomore, junior time frame, that's when you really have to dig into the details of, public, private, near, far, very competitive, just your basic, run of the mill college, whatever it might be.
Yeah. I went through, you mentioned the athletics. I played baseball in college and wasn't good enough a baseball player to go to the schools that were otherwise interesting to me. And so I had a great college experience, had a great baseball experience. I wasn't particularly good at that level, but it adds an entirely new angle to the planning process. And after the whole game has changed so much since I was in school, but if I had any takeaways from that, I would say that there are a lot of resources out there to help. Your coach, these recruiting portals. There are so many things out there that you can do to just explore what might be an option to you and what might not be, that were not around even 10 or 15 years ago. And
Right.
services like your own, like the consulting service you offer for planning for college, which we'll chat about here in a few minutes. Now, another topic that I wanted to ask you about, Brad, is so this is a show that helps business owners align their business with their personal finances and their personal resources. And there's a whole lot of opportunity to marry those two things, because when you run the business, you can structure it however on earth you want. And there are a lot of these little planning tips and tricks that pop up when we talk about different topics related to financial planning in general. What kind of things should business owners specifically know about planning for and paying for college for their kids?
Yeah. So as an example, there's some of the basics like hiring the kids into the business. I personally pay my high school and college kids to do things like laminating and graphic design, and all the computer equipment you see me on right now was all built by my tech, you know, support, which is my oldest, and he's very good at working with computers and building stuff. So he handles all of that, and I pay them well for that. I pay them what the going rate is, and then they use that money to pay for expenses so I don't have to, whether it's college or their blue jeans or whatever it is, you know, and it works really well as long as that money's not quote unquote wasted, right? I mean, if they're just going to go spend $1,000 a month at Starbucks because you paid them $1,000 a month, well, that's not efficient, of course. If they took that $1,000 and they bought their own clothes, and now you don't buy them clothes, or if they took that $1,000 and put it away for college or spend it on books or whatever it might be, well, then it's more efficient typically for, again, from a tax perspective and sometimes from a financial aid perspective, because financial aid is based on the income and the assets of both mom and dad and the student. Sometimes shifting 7 or 8,000 of income off of mom and dad's income and putting it on the student will help both taxes and financial aid. Once you go beyond 7 or 8,000, now it can have an adverse effect on financial aid, but it still might be good for taxes. So that leads you to the question of, well, am I going to get need-based aid? Because if I'm not going to get need-based aid, it doesn't matter that I messed it up, right? If your income's already $1 million, you're not going to get need-based aid no matter what you do. You may as well pay the kids as much as you reasonably can. Because yes, it messes up need-based aid, but so does your $1 million of income. So you're not going to get it no matter what you do. So that's where it kind of gets into the, there's lots of different variations, and finding the path that, option A, B, C, D, or E, which one makes the most sense, would depend on, a number of factors, including, whether or not you qualify for aid, what schools you're considering, et cetera, et cetera. So
Can I interrupt you for just a
maybe
moment,
one
Brad?
good example is just hiring the kids and shifting income.
So this concept of hiring your kids on in the business is a great opportunity. We've talked about it quite a bit on the podcast. And from a tax perspective, you mentioned the 7 or 8 $700,000 threshold as being under the limit to where it's going to impact financial aid, but still beneficial from a tax perspective. From a tax perspective, that's great because it's less than the standard deduction. And if your kid is making that much, they don't have to file a tax return. They don't pay any tax at all. And if you compare you paying them for doing stuff around the office and you keeping that $7,000 or $8,000, you're paying tax on that $7,000 or $8,000 at your marginal bracket. If you hire the kids, you pay them for it. Yes, you pay payroll taxes on it, but if it's less than the standard deduction, there's no income tax ramifications at all. Can you explain the details of why that threshold is relevant for financial aid purposes?
Yes. So need-based aid is calculated based on income and assets of mom and dad and the student. And then the other big factors are the school you're considering and the price tag of that school and the number of students that the parents are supporting. And then there's a lot of other factors that you don't have a lot of control over, like how old you are. You might get a slightly more or less aid based on your age, which state you live in. There's credits for various the taxes in a state. But all those things are generally either out of your control or are very minor as far as what impact it will have. And then in a typical 18-year-old going from high school up straight to college, they don't have a lot of income or assets anyway, unless, again, you're a parent or a business owner or something that's giving them income and assets. Well, income and assets are assessed higher if it's in the student's name than if it's in the parent's name. So income for a student is assessed at a flat 20%. Income for a parent is assessed at up to 5.6%. Excuse me, up to 49%. So but it's a sliding scale. So finding that, I think I just messed up those numbers. So let me start over there. So
I think I think I understand your point. So if you're pulling $1 million as a parent out of the business, that's not going to impact the equation because there will be no need-based aid whatsoever, regardless of what your kid's income is. But
correct.
If you're at a more modest level of income, you pay your kids $7,000 or $8,000. $7,000 or $8,000 of income to the student is below the threshold at which that will count negatively for them as far as financial aid determination. Did I summarize that correctly?
You did, yes. So for income, students can have income up to, and it's a sliding scale, it's about $7,000, where it has zero impact. And that's total income. So if they happen to work for mom and dad's business and an outside job of some sort, you want to keep that in mind. Or if the student also would receive, dividends from investments or that type of thing. And so it's total income. So, but again, most of the time, if you're hiring the student, you're the only source of income for that student.
So takeaway here is opportunity number one for business owners. Hire your kid in the business. There are other benefits of doing that, which we talked about on the podcast. Set them up with a Roth IRA and some other cool stuff.
Yes.
But if they're in line for any kind of need-based aid, you probably don't want to pay them more than $7,000 or $8,000. Is it safe to say?
That is true. Yes. And look up the exact number that's on my website. You can go, look that up pretty quickly. And the same with assets, right? Is you can shift assets to students. Unfortunately, it's from $1 for assets. But again, if you're not going to qualify for any need-based aid, you don't care. And having them realize the capital gain when they sell the Google stock or whatever it is might be more beneficial than having you realize the capital gain. So that's one area. Kind of shifting from there, there's also like a tuition reimbursement plan or a 127 plan. So business owners can set up a tuition reimbursement plan that essentially says, the large corporations have them. If you work for me or for this big company, if you want to go back to school, if you get A's in the classes, we'll give you 100% of whatever you paid. Well, if you get a B, we'll give you 80%. If you get a C or less, we're not paying. Something like that. So mom and dad could set up the exact same plan and say, if you get a F or better, we'll reimburse you. Because again, you want it to happen. Now, for this plan to work, it has to be available to all employees. So if you're a small business that only hires the kids, that makes it easy. But if you had 10 other employees, then you have to offer it to them as well. So sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, depending on whether those other employees would take advantage of it or not. If all the other employees aren't interested in education anymore, if they're all older, let's say, they're not going to do it anyway. So you can offer it to them. They don't take it, but your kids do. It works fine. And then the other challenge is if it's the children of the business owners, then there's the attribution rules where income to the student is the equivalent of income to the parent. So the student might need to be 21 before it will work well. So there's an additional wrinkle there. But once it does work, you can transfer up to $5,250 to the student, tax deductible to the business, tax free to the student. So you could do that potentially on top of what you're paying them as a salary.
Sure.
And it works well for grad school. If they're going on for their MBA or something, they're likely older than 21. And sometimes it's just junior, senior year, they're older than 21 too, depending on how old of a student they were when they started.
And it sounds like if your kids are your only employees, it's probably better to set up the tuition reimbursement because you're not paying payroll tax on any of that money, right? It
Correct.
essentially makes the entire portion of the tuition coming out of the pocket of the family tax free.
Right. Or you do both. I pay them $7,000 or $8,000 and another $5,250. Because again, sometimes college is going to be, you're going to need college is say $25,000 a year. You need $100,000.
Right.
And if you can transfer more, again, depending on the tax years and that type of thing, but you might be able to get 15 or 20 transferred each year. If they need it for the bills that are there, you spend it. Otherwise they could save it for future college as well, depending on how old they are. You can start doing some of these things, when they're in high school or even younger, depending on what jobs they can do in your business, depending on what kind of business you have.
Right. What's the protocol for establishing a 127 plan like we're describing here?
Yeah. So it's interesting. It must be a written plan, but it's not nearly as formal as, say, a 401k plan or that type of thing, where there's all these documents and stuff that you need to do. You must have a written plan. You must offer it to all your employees, and those types of things. But I've seen some prototype plans that are 2 pages long, and they're just very basic. So it's one of those gray areas. It's kind of like some of the other FMLA and some of the other things where the rules are pretty basic. One's just some sort of written plan and if you're a really small business and it's only the kids, you don't necessarily spend a lot of time on it because you're not going to have employees that are fighting over whether they deserve it or not. If you had a bigger company and you had 50 employees, then you might want to run it through some HR consultant or something to make sure it's fair. And, in case you get a disgruntled employee that says, hey, this tuition reimbursement, isn't fair for some reason. And now you want to make sure it passes muster.
Right. Yeah. It sounds like something, if you have more than a couple employees, you probably want to request a bona fide plan from your labor attorney, I would guess, rather than downloading something on LegalZoom.
Right. Exactly.
So what else beyond that, Brad? We've got hire your kid in the business, set up a tuition reimbursement plan. What else for business owners?
Right. And then certainly you can control shifting income and shifting assets around need-based aid planning. Sometimes we'll have large amounts of assets that are accessible, and you want to hide those assets so you can put them into the retirement plan. And you might need to have a 401k or a solo 401k or some other plan that allows you to dump big numbers in order to hide those assets. Managing your income so that you qualify for the tax credit. There's a American Opportunity Tax Credit that phases out between 160 and 180 for married. And I don't remember what the single is. I think 90, half of that, I think. So 80 to 90 if you're single.
And
So
if
sometimes
I
we'll
can
have,
just rewind real quick, you mentioned dumping assets in a 401k or a solo 401k plan. What I heard you say is, for the purpose of filling out the FAFSA and determining need-based aid, the government and each of the schools you're going to apply to are looking at your income and assets and the kids' income and assets. So if you have a whole bunch of assets, you're expected, right? The output of that form is what's called expected family contribution. If you have a whole bunch of cash in the bank, you're expected to use some of that to help your kids go to school. And so what you're talking about is setting up some kind of qualified retirement plan in the business to shield those assets from that expectation.
yes,
Did I summarize that appropriately?
very good. Yes.
So
No,
there
you're
are,
right. So not all assets count. So things that count generally are mutual funds and stocks and bonds and that type of thing. And college savings plans. What does not count generally is retirement assets. So 401ks, IRAs, Roths, pensions, all those types of things.
right.
Another thing that doesn't count, that gets a little confusing, is the small business itself. If it's under 100 employees, more than 50% owned by the family, then the small business itself does not count for the FAFSA. Now, the wrinkle there is a lot of the elite schools and high-end schools will ask about the business anyway because they're going to use the CSS profile, which is a secondary financial aid form where they will learn about this business and they will count it against you. So there's another example of, well, if you know you've got a problem, if they see the business, you might try and find schools that won't see the business because they'll only use the FAFSA instead of the CSS profile. I've seen that a few times where the business isn't creating a lot of cash flow, so their income is relatively low, but the business itself has a lot of assets and therefore is valued highly. And so we don't want to have to disclose that. So again, some colleges will literally ask for tax records and net worth of the business and try and get a better handle on what the business is all about.
Right. There are all sorts of ways to restructure, retitle, put in different accounts. All have different ramifications, short and long term, though. And
Right.
for example, the retirement account option that we're talking about, if you have cash in the bank, you're expected to use that to help your kid go to college. If that cash is in a 401k plan, it's not accessible to you. Therefore, you're not expected to use it. But if you set up a 401k plan just for this purpose, there are a whole bunch of other strings attached and ramifications you need to be comfortable with.
Right.
And
Another example of sharing with your employees, right? You have to do it for everybody in the business,
yep,
not just you and the kids.
exactly.
So yeah, so I think those are probably the biggest ones that I can think of that, business owners, and then again, there's lots of ways to potentially, very similar to the tax planning, right? Of just trying to push income into different years and that type of thing, where if you're the boss and you can choose to give yourself a bonus or not, and you choose which year you'd give it in and all those types of things. So, again, so business owners just have additional opportunities and therefore additional complexity around what they should and shouldn't do. And then, oftentimes if the business is successful, maybe it just can't be done. And now you're just going to go and say, all right, need-based aid is not going to work. Let's focus on merit aid. Let's focus on tax planning. Let's focus on, hiring the kids and some of those things where it's not, you're not worried about the aid as much as the taxes, and some of those things. So there's different aspects that come into play for business owners. And that can be true business owners and the self-employed type person, the consultant, where you do your own taxes, but maybe you're just a sole proprietor. So it's kind of a business, kind of not, where you're working for one company even potentially.
Yeah.
Um,
Right.
so there's a lot
So,
of work that can be done there.
so you've worked with a whole bunch of families over the years, and I would guess that there are probably some similar mistakes that pop up somewhat frequently. What are some of the top things you see people getting wrong when it comes time to plan for a future college education?
Right. I think there's a lot of misinformation and assumptions in general, where someone will say something like, well, I'm not going to qualify for this or that because my brother-in-law didn't qualify for this or that. But in reality, unless your brother-in-law is very similar to you and your student's very similar, et cetera, maybe they're not a good proxy for how it's going to work for you. So I've had a lot of people say things like, I'm not going to get aid, and we run the numbers and they actually do qualify. Or just the opposite. My brother-in-law got this fantastic scholarship from this college. My kid's going to get the same scholarship. It's like, well, no, your kid's not the same. They didn't go to the same high school. They don't have the same grades. And what you're talking about was grade related, right? People talk about things like, you go to a high school graduation at a private high school, and somewhere in the literature, they're going to talk about the millions and millions of scholarships that their kids won. The challenge, of course, is if you apply to the right schools, you're going to get scholarships no matter what, because they offer 100 scholarships to everybody. And if you apply to the wrong schools, you're not going to get scholarships. And it's understanding at a deeper level what they're talking about. And, it frustrates me because these private schools claim all like these scholarships are because their kids went to their fantastic private school. It's just that the public schools don't do the effort of adding it all up and figuring it out. So you don't have a frame of reference that, well, the private school just down this, or the public high school in the nice suburb down the street that is also very strong, had almost as much scholarships, or maybe even more. It's just that they don't track it and publish it like the private school does. And I'm not saying private schools are bad. I sent one of my kids to a private high school, and it was a great experience for him, and I would do it all over again in a heartbeat. But it's not an automatic, we're paying all this tuition in high school so that we save a bunch of money in college. That's a big fallacy.
Yeah. Yeah, it seems like a poor way to evaluate experience and success.
Right. And, so I guess those are, I guess in another general mistake I see is people start too late. I always tell, my standard story is I've never, ever had anyone tell me they started this too early, but I've had hundreds of people say I started this too late.
Right.
It's like, I feel like I'm behind, I'm scrambling. And I mean, that is, again, very general. And then, of course, people make mistakes filling out financial aid. People make, the way the system works right now, right? You've got accountants and stuff that should know better when it comes to doing all the paperwork and forms and all that kind of stuff. And if you're in over your head, you go hire one. When it comes to financial aid, if you're in over your head, you just muddle through it. And the good news is lots of people make mistakes, both to the positive and the negative. And, the bad news is they don't even know what's going on. And the colleges don't either, because it's just a different ecosystem. It's not like taxes where there's audits and there's stuff going on at the level that there is for a typical tax return type of thing. And there's not case law. There's not lawsuits going on and that kind of stuff where they argue over this particular finer point, and then it's settled as a lawsuit. And now we've got precedent of this is the way it works from here on out, because, the IRS won the lawsuit. Therefore, the IRS is going to sue me next if I try it again. So I'm not going to do it. None of that really exists when you get to the financial aid and how does the college system work. It's a little more on your honor or do the best you can. And in the end, a lot of times it's the colleges themselves that are, they're offering up their own money in some cases, so they can do it however they want. And as long as the gist of the forms are good enough, then they're happy. And they're not going to, again, worry about the details as often.
So how do you know when you're back to an earlier question I asked you? How do you know whether you're applying to a reputable school with a reputable financial aid office and versus one that might not be so transparent?
Yeah, so that's
Seems like
the
a total
challenge.
roll of the
So,
dice.
yes, I mean, in general, colleges try to be set up systems and try and be fair. They don't want two families that look very much alike to get totally different offers. So they set up their systems, but then it's always up to interpretation, right? Here's an what is your house worth? Right? We've got 4 different numbers. We've got what Zillow says, we've got what we paid for it, we got what the tax roll says, we've got all these different numbers, and they may be very similar, they may be very different. And which one you use, will they take the one you offer? Probably. Although they do double check that sometimes by looking at Zillow or some of the other databases and seeing what might be closer to real. But there's a lot of gray area. What is your business worth is another great example, right? I mean, that's until you actually sell it, nobody knows for sure. And of course, that's not going to happen. And, we have the same problems around, divorce and estate planning and estates and that type of thing of what is it worth and how much taxes should we pay because of that. So, yeah, I mean, I guess that's what's interesting, though, is once you understand the system, a lot of colleges have what we call net price calculators. So you can literally go to their website and type in a bunch of data and get an estimate of what that college may cost. Now, I worked with families at some of the high-end schools where we call the office and say, was this calculator accurate? And they say it's perfectly accurate. It does exactly the same thing that we do in our office. So if you did the inputs properly, you're going to get the same answer we're going to get. Now, that's a big catch, though, because when a blank says, what is your assets? And then you click on the information button, it says include these things, but not those things, except for this, and then do it this way. And then, so if you can follow along, you can get a very good estimate. So I think that's a big change that people need to realize is possible, is you can have a good understanding of at least an estimate of what colleges are going to cost before you apply, instead of waiting till the end and getting an offer and being shocked. I've had families come to me and say, we applied to these 7 schools, 4 of them we didn't get accepted to, and the 3 that we got into are crazy expensive. And I look at the list and I go, okay, well, none of these offer any sort of merit aid. Your income's high enough, you're not going to get any need-based aid. You should have known you're going to pay full price from day one. But they didn't understand that these schools do it this way and those schools do it that way. And they thought, well, my kid's brilliant, they're going to get scholarships. But not at these schools, because either they don't offer it or he's not brilliant enough at these schools. So they, again, poor assumptions. So that's, where I help families a lot is understanding what's a reasonable price to pay. Again, most people would say, I can't afford anything, or I want college to be $1,000 a year. Well, that's not going to happen for most families. That's not realistic. But if you can go to a state school for $28,000, or you can go to the private school for $32,000, a lot of families are going to look at that and say, you know what? If there's a good reason to go to slightly more expensive, if we like it better, whether it's class size or has the right major or whatever it is, we're willing to spend a little bit more. That's not going to make that big a difference in our life.
Right.
Sometimes it's those 2 schools plus 2 other schools that are at 58,000. And if you're lucky, everybody likes the low cost schools. But what happens if your student falls in love with the one that's 58 when the rest are 52? Is it worth spending that extra? Or will you allow your student to spend the extra and say, well, yeah, you can borrow that money. We'll help you. That's another myth out there that I think a lot of people is, my kid's going to borrow a bunch of money. It's like, no, he's not. Or she, right? Your student can't only borrow $5,500 as a freshman typically. And after that, mom and dad can borrow on a plus loan, or mom and dad can co-sign a private loan. But when we hear these things about the student graduating with $100,000 in debt, they didn't do it alone. They had to have some sort of co-signer, or they went on to get some sort of graduate degree or some other degree where once you graduate and go on to medical school, MBA, that type of stuff, a lot more loans are available to students there. But theoretically, you're an adult now and you should know better. But in all these situations, there should have been, somebody beyond the 18-year-old making decisions. And if the parents are signing and co-signing and facilitating it, again, that's where I feel like they need to be more educated about what the options are. And I'm not saying you shouldn't spend, lots of money on college. I've got, lots of families that do, but they know what they're getting into and they feel they can afford it. Versus I felt backed into a corner. I had no choice but to spend this kind of money.
I've heard a lot of other college planning professionals liken this to a mortgage pre-approval process. So many people, to your point, they go down the road of applying, and then they have their stretch schools and their safety schools, and then the cost paperwork comes in after the applications have been approved, and every single one of them is out of the price range. And you shouldn't be applying to anything that you can't afford in the first place. If you or I went to go put an offer in on the mansion down the street that's way out of our budget, what has to happen first, right? The lender has to approve us for the loan before we can start going around making offers. And we should think of college funding in the same light. Do the work of knowing what your resources and income and comfort level paying out of pocket are in the beginning, and then use that to guide where you're going to apply and visit. And that way your kid's not falling in love with the $80,000 out of state tuition or private school tuition when you can't come anywhere near affording that.
Right.
It seems logical.
Exactly. Yes, exactly. Another example would be if you're car shopping and there's a sticker price, and then back before COVID, you didn't pay sticker, you paid something less usually. Maybe now you pay something more, but there was, the sticker price is kind of a starting point. It isn't necessarily what you're going to pay. Now imagine if some of those cars were actually 50% off or 75% off. Well, now, should I be on the Mercedes and BMW lot or not? Am I going to get 50% off or 75% off?
Right.
If I am, well, then they're pretty competitive. If I'm not, I shouldn't be falling in love with a BMW because I'm going to end up paying full price and it's not going to end well.
Right.
But you got to kind of figure that out ahead of time of, well, am I going to qualify for aid at some of these schools, whether it's need or merit, or maybe parents or grandparents or somebody's already saved a good nest egg. Maybe you've got 100 or 200,000 saved, but you've got 2 or 3 kids and you're saying, well, how does that play out? Is that enough? And then we get into the discussions around, well, how are you fair among kids, right? If one kid goes to an expensive school and spends $30,000 a year, and the next kid wins scholarships at a low-cost school and spends $10,000 a year, is that fair? Are you going to write a check at the end to balance it out? Are you, some parents will say to each their own. It's automatically fair because they got what they needed and no more. And other parents would say, no, I'm going to make the one that spent more on college take a bunch of loans because I'm only good for 10. And some parents would say, well, I was good for 40. They only spent 30, so I'm happy. And I will literally write a check to the other kids or help them with a down payment on a house or give them a bigger wedding or whatever it is in order to, balance things out and make them either fair or equal or whatever that might mean. Right.
Right. Right.
Fair is not always equal and equal is not always fair.
Very rarely. That's right. So Brad, tell us a little bit about your college funding business and how you help families specifically.
Right. So again, all the stuff that we've talked about is where, what I help families do. So ideally we start early enough that we can start talking about what schools, visits and that type of thing, where we're building a list and understanding, what colleges will cost on that list, and then we can refine the list if we discover that need-based or merit aid is a good or a bad thing, or maybe we need to find schools where merit aid will happen, and therefore maybe the stretch schools aren't going to work as well, because you're, by definition, if you're stretching to get in, you're not scholarship material because you just barely squeaked in. So maybe you need to consider different schools, and getting through the family politics of that, of I want the name brand or I don't want the name brand or whatever it is, so starting there, doing a need-based aid analysis, a merit analysis, figuring out how much we can afford to save, quick budgeting, based on you paying this amount for 3 kids, you're going to need to save between now and the end of college $1,200 a month to do this. Well, that's easy. Let's do more. Okay. Well, if we spend if we put away $2,000 a month, we can do that. Or if we put in, and I've had $3,600 a month college budgets for 10 years, and they were very happy with that. And I've had families say, once we cross $500, we're just in over our head. So we got to, figure out the lower cost options or whatever it is. So working through those types of, the financial side of things. And it's an iterative process, right? So it's not, we just create a plan and good luck. It's, here's a kind of a preliminary plan and some ideas, and let's explore these things. So you said you wanted these types of schools, but understand that those schools are expensive. So here's some alternatives. Why don't you visit some alternatives or look into these alternatives? And sometimes they come back and say, oh, we love the alternatives. We're glad we looked at them. Sometimes they come back and say, we don't like alternatives. We really want to figure out how to make the more expensive one happen. Both are fine. I mean, in the end, as I've mentioned, we all spend our money on something. And I can't argue that education is bad. So if you want to spend more or less, just understanding what the options are, and then making sure we do it as efficiently as possible, making sure we get all the tax breaks we can, making sure we get all the, all the aid we can, negotiating with the schools, going back and, if we don't get a good offer, and figuring out why, if we did something wrong on the forms, or if we can appeal, or there's ways that we can increase things, making sure we have a list that's, is financially appropriate, where we have some schools that's likely to be a safety school, not academically, but a safety school of, those are schools that we can afford, most likely, right? If they're all, if I go to this school, I can only go if I win the presidential scholarship. And the odds of me winning the presidential scholarship aren't 0, but they're low. I have a shot at it, but so do, maybe 1 in 10. So if I get the presidential scholarship, it works great. If I don't, it'll be crazy expensive and I'll have to pass. Okay, well then what are the other choices? Do you have some other choices that make sense? So kind of working out that whole process, ideally starting freshman, sophomore year. And then at the very end, it's like, we know a school, we know a price, we've got some, where's the money going to come from for the first bill? Where's the money going to come from the second bill? Here's a 4-year payment plan. We're going to take this much out of college savings. We're going to take this much out of cash flow. We're going to take this much out of the bank, this much out of our investments. We're going to continue to pay the kids. If you're a business owner, we're going to, whatever it might be. And just kind of go from the beginning where you don't understand much, and kind of give you a little bit of homework of go visit, go do a couple things. Once you learn, college planning 101, then we'll do college planning 201. But it's really tough to talk about 201 until you've done 101. So
right.
A lot of
So
times it's just go visit some schools, learn some of the basics, and then we'll talk again about how to do better visits.
So for people out there who have kids entering this phase of their life and they want to learn more, where should we direct them?
Right?
Website?
So,
You have a
yep, I
podcast
have
as
a
well?
website. Yep. Website's called tamingthehighcostofcollege.com. And I also have a podcast by that name for those that are obviously we're on a podcast here, so you understand how that works. So you can listen to the podcast on that Taming. You can get a hold of us. There's a Work with Brad page where you can contact us if you want to go directly. I'm building a course, so we're going to have a course soon. So there's kind of an in-between option if you just want to kind of learn some of the basics and get your feet wet. You can do that. There's also a whole lot of free resources. We offer a free newsletter with lots of topics, scholarship guide for busy parents, understanding need-based and merit scholarships, loan guides, and there's actually a way for you to get in there and put in your financial information and compare your situation and get an estimated price for 3 schools through the website as well, where again you'll get an idea of how you qualify for need-based aid and what type of merit aid you might expect at a couple schools of your choosing to kind of give you a preliminary look, and lots of other resources as well. Cost of colleges by state is another popular one. So I've got a table of the typical schools in a state and what their list price is and what their average net price is based on your income. So that's a great resource to where some of the high list price schools, when you see the net price, you go, oh, wow, well, maybe it lists at 65, but if the average in my category is 35, maybe it is a school I would consider based on those numbers.
Very cool. Well, thank you for taking the time to join us today, Brad. I think we covered some good ground, particularly the few points that business owners can use to reduce the net cost of college for their kids and their family. And I appreciate the time and the wisdom. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for tuning in to Grow Money Business, the podcast dedicated to helping business owners grow both their wealth and business on their own terms. Be sure to subscribe to the podcast on iTunes, Google Play, or wherever you digest podcasts to ensure you don't miss out on future episodes and announcements. And feel free to submit questions to growmoneybusiness.com.